Moctezuma versus Cortés. When gods met steel, the gathering storm, the morning mist, rose from Lake Texcoco, like incense from 1,000 temples. As two worlds prepared to collide in the heart of Tenochtitlan, on one side stood Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, Huitilatuani, of the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica, descendant of gods, ruler of millions. On the other approached Hernán Cortés, a minor Spanish nobleman, whose audacity had already toppled kingdoms, and whose arrival would shatter the cosmic order that had governed the Americas for millennia. The emperor had ruled for 17 years, expanding his dominion from the tropical coasts, the northern deserts, commanding tribute from over 400 city-states. His word was law across territories that dwarfed European kingdoms. His temples gleamed with gold beyond Spanish dreams, and his armies had never known defeat. Yet as dawn broke on November 8, 1519, Moctezuma faced a crisis that challenged everything he understood about power, divinity, and the nature of reality itself. From his palace windows overlooking the Great Plaza, the emperor could see the causeway stretching across the lake toward the mainland, where dust clouds marked the approach of the strangers who claimed to be men, but possessed powers that defied explanation. They rode upon beasts that were neither deer nor jaguar, wielded thunder that could kill at distances beyond any arrow's reach, and wore skin that gleamed like silver in sunlight. Their leader, this Cortés, had already accomplished the impossible, uniting the empire's enemies against it. Moctezuma's advisors cluster around him like anxious birds, their feathered cloaks rustling with nervous energy. The high priest Tlacaelel spoke in hushed tones of ancient prophecies and the possible return of Quetzal, while the military commanders Cuitlahuac and Cacamatzin urged immediate action against the approaching threat. But the emperor remained silent, his obsidian mirror reflecting not answers, but deeper questions about the nature of divine will and mortal power. The Spanish force that approached Tenochtitlan numbered fewer than 400 Europeans, yet they commanded indigenous allies beyond counting. The Tlaxcalans, ancient enemies of the empire, marched in disciplined ranks alongside warriors from Zempoala, Huayosengo, and dozens of smaller communities that had suffered under Aztec tribute demands. This coalition of the conquered represented Moctezuma's worst nightmare, not foreign invasion but domestic rebellion armed with supernatural weapons. As the procession reached the causeway's edge, Moctezuma made his decision. He would meet these strangers, not as an enemy but as the divine ruler he was born to be, confident that his sacred authority would prove superior to any earthly power. This choice, born from a lifetime of unquestioned supremacy and theological certainty, would doom an empire. The God Emperor's dilemma. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin had inherited more than an empire. He had received the accumulated wisdom and burden of a cosmic order that placed him at the intersection of heaven and earth. Born around 1466, he was the younger son of Axayacatl and had never expected to rule, but the deaths of his brothers and his own military brilliance in campaigns against the Huastis and Mextecs had elevated him to the throne in 1502, where he had proven himself perhaps the most capable administrator in Aztec history. Under his rule, the empire had reached its zenith. The tribute rolls recorded in his palace archives documented wealth that flowed from tropical lowlands and highland valleys, cacao and jade, cotton and obsidian, feathers and gold. His engineers had constructed aqueducts that brought fresh water across vast distances. His architects had built temples that scraped the sky, and his merchants had extended trade networks from the Arctic to the Isthmus of Panama. Yet this very success had created the vulnerabilities that Cortés would exploit. The empire's rapid expansion had generated resentment among newly conquered peoples who retained vivid memories of independence. The tribute system that funded Aztec grandeur also created economic hardship in subject communities, while the religious demands for sacrificial victims had turned warfare from a means of negotiation into an instrument of terror. More subtly, Moctezuma's theological education had prepared him to rule within a cosmic framework, that assumed divine intervention in human affairs. The priests had taught him to read omens in the flight of birds, to interpret natural disasters as messages from the gods, and to understand his own authority as a manifestation of celestial will. This religious sophistication, which had served him well in traditional governance, became a crippling disadvantage when faced with an enemy who operated according to entirely different assumptions about the relationship between supernatural and temporal power. The emperor's initial response to reports of strange visitors along the coast had followed established protocols for dealing with potentially divine manifestation. He had sent embassies bearing precious gifts, arranged for careful intelligence gathering, and consulted with the most learned priests about the prophetic significance of these unprecedented events. When early reports described bearded men riding four-legged beasts and commanding thunder, the theological implications seemed clear. These were either gods testing mortal devotion, or demons seeking to overthrow cosmic order. The gifts that Moctezuma had sent to Cortés, golden suns and silver moons, feathered cloaks and jade ornaments, reflected both diplomatic protocol and religious obligation. If these strangers were divine, they deserved offerings worthy of their celestial state. If they were mortal, such magnificent presents would demonstrate Aztec wealth and power, while establishing the emperor's generosity and wisdom. Either way, the gifts served Moctezuma's strategic purposes, while adhering to the ceremonial requirements that governed interactions with supernatural force. But Cortés had interpreted these offerings as evidence of weakness rather than strength, proof of vast wealth awaiting seizure rather than recognition of his divine authority. This fundamental misunderstanding reflected the broader cultural chasm that separated European and Mesoamerican conceptions of power, diplomacy, and the relationship between material wealth and spiritual authority. The emperor's decision to receive the Spanish expedition in Tenochtitlan represented perhaps the most fateful choice in American history. Military advisors had urged him to meet the invaders on the mainland, where Aztec numerical superiority could be brought to bear without the geographic constraints imposed by the lake and causeway. Diplomatic counselors had suggested negotiating from a position of strength, using the capital's defenses to demonstrate imperial power, while maintaining the option of strategic withdrawal. Instead, Moctezuma chose to welcome the strangers into the heart of his empire, confident that the city's magnificence would overwhelm them with awe, while placing them under obligations of gratitude and reciprocity that would ensure their compliance with imperial will. This decision reflected both the emperor's personal courage and his fundamental misunderstanding of European motivations and method. The conquistador's calculation: Hernán Cortés possessed qualities that made him uniquely dangerous to established order: intelligence without wisdom, ambition unconstrained by scruple, and the ability to inspire loyalty among men who should have known better. Born around 1485 in Medellín, Extremadura, he came from the minor nobility that produced Spain's most effective conquistadors, men with enough education to understand opportunity, but insufficient inheritance to achieve comfortable mediocrity. His early years in the Caribbean had taught him lessons that traditional European warfare could never have provided. In Hispaniola and Cuba, he had observed how indigenous political systems could be manipulated through careful exploitation of internal division, how superior military technology could multiply the effectiveness of small forces, and how psychological warfare could achieve victories that conventional tactics could not deliver. The expedition that departed Cuba in February 1519 represented the culmination of Cortés's colonial experience and his assessment of Mexican opportunity. His 508 Spanish soldiers carried the most advanced military technology of their era: steel weapons that could cleave obsidian blades, crossbows that could penetrate cotton armor, and firearms that created terror even when they missed their target. More importantly, his 16 horses provided mobility and psychological advantage that would prove decisive in battles against enemies who had never encountered mounted warfare. Yet Cortés understood that technology alone could not conquer an empire. His real weapon was strategic intelligence, the ability to read political situations, identify exploitable weaknesses, and adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. The months of coastal exploration that preceded his march on Tenochtitlan had provided invaluable information about Mexican politics, economy and military organization while revealing the depth of resentment that Spanish arms could weaponize against Aztec rule. The alliance with Tlaxcala represented Cortés's masterpiece of strategic manipulation. The Tlaxcalans had resisted Aztec expansion for decades, maintaining their independence through military skill and geographic advantages, while watching their trade routes and agricultural production suffer under imperial pressure. Cortés offered them something no indigenous leader could provide: the prospect of overthrowing rather than merely resisting Aztec hegemony. The negotiations that created this alliance required diplomatic skills that Cortés had developed through years of managing relationships with Spanish officials, indigenous leaders, and rival conquistadors. He understood how to present Spanish military support as liberation rather than conquest, how to frame European objectives as compatible with native aspirations, and how to structure agreements that appeared to benefit all parties while serving primarily Spanish interests. The massacre at Cholula demonstrated Cortés' willingness to employ terror as a political weapon. When intelligence suggested that the city's leaders were planning treachery, Cortés ordered a preemptive strike that killed thousands of civilians and destroyed one of Mesoamerica's most important religious centers. This atrocity served multiple strategic purposes. It demonstrated Spanish ruthlessness to potential enemies, eliminated a possible threat to his line of communication, and provided his Tlaxcalan allies with revenge against a traditional rival. More subtly, the Cholula massacre revealed Cortés' understanding of psychological warfare's power to multiply military force. The news of what Spanish weapons could accomplish spread across central Mexico faster than any army could march, creating terror among potential enemies while encouraging submission among uncommitted communities. By the time the expedition approached Tenochtitlan, Spanish reputation had preceded them, transforming a military force of 400 men into a symbol of irresistible destruction. Cortés's decision to march directly on the Aztec capital reflected both supreme confidence and accurate assessment of strategic necessity. Prolonged campaigning in the Mexican highlands would have exposed his force to attrition from disease, desertion, and enemy action, while providing Moctezuma with time to organize effective resistance. A direct assault on the empire's heart, conversely, would force the emperor to make immediate decisions under maximum pressure while preventing the coordination of imperial resources against Spanish objectives. The conquistador's greatest asset was his ability to think beyond conventional military categories. Where traditional commanders saw battles to be won or lost, Cortés saw political situations to be exploited. Where others might have sought territorial conquest through systematic occupation, he aimed for psychological domination through spectacular demonstration of European capability. His march on Tenochtitlan was less a military campaign than an elaborate performance designed to convince indigenous audiences that Spanish power was both irresistible and inevitable. The meeting of worlds, November 8, 1519, dawned clear and cold over Lake Texcoco, as two processions prepared for an encounter that would reshape the America. From the east came Cortés and his coalition of European technology and indigenous ambition, while from the west approached Moctezuma and the full ceremonial majesty of an empire that had ruled Mesoamerica for nearly a century. The Aztec Emperor's procession reflected the accumulated artistic achievement of countless generations. His litter gleamed with gold that had been hammered into sheets thinner than paper and worked into patterns that captured sunlight like crystallized flame. The feathered canopy above his head displayed the plumage of hundreds of tropical birds, quetzals and parrots, hummingbirds and eagles arranged in designs that told the mythological history of the Mexica people from their departure from Aztlan to their dominion over the lake. Moctezuma himself wore garments that represented the height of Mesoamerican craftsmanship. His Tilmetli cloak incorporated cotton so fine it felt like silk, dyed with cochineal red that had been reserved for royal use since the empire's founding. The gold ornaments adorning his person, nose plugs and ear spools, necklaces and bracelets, carried symbolic meanings that connected his mortal authority to cosmic forces, while the obsidian mirror on his forehead reflected both earthly light and divine wisdom. The nobles who accompanied him represented the political and religious elite of an empire that stretched from sea to sea. Cacamatzin, Lord of Texcoco, commanded the loyalty of engineers who had built the causeways and aqueducts that made Tenochtitlan possible. Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother and Lord of Ixtapalapa, controlled the southern approaches to the capital while commanding armies that had never known defeat. The high priest Tlacaelel bore the sacred bundles that contained the god's promises to the Mexica people, while the tribute collectors carried the records that documented the empire's vast wealth. Behind this magnificent procession stretched the city itself, a testament to human ingenuity that rivaled anything in Europe. The pyramids of the Templo Mayor rose higher than Seville's cathedral, their stones carved with such precision that no mortar was needed to hold them in place. The palace complexes that housed the imperial administration covered acres of ground, their courtyards filled with gardens that recreated the entire ecosystem of the empire in miniature. The causeways that connected the island city to the mainland represented engineering achievements that European technology could not duplicate. These raised roads incorporated sophisticated drainage systems that prevented flooding while allowing canoe traffic to pass beneath them. The markets that lined their routes displayed goods from every corner of the known world: cacao from the tropical lowlands, obsidian from the volcanic highlands, jade from Guatemala, and shells from both the Pacific and Atlantic coast. Cortés's procession, by contrast, displayed the practical efficiency of European military technology wedded to indigenous political calculation. His Spanish soldiers marched in formations that reflected decades of warfare against Muslim kingdoms in Iberia, their steel weapons maintained with obsessive care and their crossbows ready for instant use. The cannon that rumbled behind them on wooden wheels represented the cutting edge of 16th century metallurgy, while the horses that carried his cavalry created clouds of dust that announced Spanish power from miles away. Yet the most significant element of Cortés's procession was the thousands of indigenous allies who surrounded the Spanish court. Tlaxcalan warriors painted for war displayed the disciplined fury that had resisted Aztec expansion for generations, while Chempolan nobles carried the grudges of communities that had suffered under imperial tribute demand. These indigenous forces provided not only military strength but also legitimacy. They transformed what might have appeared to be foreign invasion into civil war. The translator who rode between these forces carried perhaps the greatest burden of all. Doña Marina, known to the Spanish as La Malinche, had been born into the Maya nobility before being sold into slavery and given to Cortés as a gift from the people of Tabasco. Her linguistic abilities, she spoke Nahuatl and Maya, and Spanish, made communication possible between leaders who shared no common cultural reference points, while her intelligence and political instincts had made her Cortés's most trusted advisor. As the two processions approached each other on the causeway, the weight of history pressed down like the mountain air. Every step brought together worldviews that had developed in complete isolation for thousands of years, technologies that reflected entirely different relationships with nature, and political systems that embodied contradictory assumptions about the sources and purposes of human authority. The moment when Moctezuma and Cortés first saw each other across the narrow space of the causeway, neither could have fully understood what was ending and what was beginning. The emperor saw either a god to be honored, or a mortal to be absorbed into the cosmic order that had always governed human affairs. The conquistador saw an obstacle to be overcome or a resource to be exploited in service of objectives that transcended any individual. Between them stretched not merely physical distance but the conceptual chasm that separated two entirely different ways of understanding what it meant to be human in a world ruled by forces beyond mortal comprehension. The meeting that was about to occur would determine whether these differences could coexist, or whether one worldview would consume the other entirely. The fatal embrace. When Moctezuma Xcoyotzin descended from his golden litter to greet Hernán Cortés on the causeway of Iztapalapa, he performed an act that violated every principle of imperial protocol while demonstrating the theological confusion that would doom his empire. Never in the memory of living men had an Aztec emperor lowered himself to meet any mortal being as an equal. Yet the cosmic implications of these strangers' arrival seemed to demand unprecedented gestures of respect and recognition. The emperor approached Cortés with steps measured according to ancient ceremonial rhythms, his obsidian sandals clicking against the stone causeway in patterns that echoed the sacred calendar. The nobles who surrounded him maintained precise formations that reflected the cosmic hierarchy, with each position carefully calculated to display proper relationships between earthly and divine authority. The incense that burned in jade braziers carried prayers to Huitzilopochtli and Quetzalcoatl, seeking guidance for an encounter that had no precedent in Mexica history. Cortés, for his part, advanced with the confidence of a man who had gambled everything on a single audacious stroke and found fortune smiling upon his boldness. His steel armor gleamed in the late morning sun, while the Spanish banner that fluttered above his head displayed the crosses and castles that symbolized European Christianity and imperial ambition. Behind him marched men who had already conquered Caribbean islands and Maya kingdoms, their crossbows loaded and their swords loose in their sheaths despite the ceremonial nature of the occasion.
Gifts that Moctezuma presented to Cortés represented the finest achievements of Mesoamerican craftsmanship. Necklaces of pure gold, alternated with jade beads that had been carved into perfect spheres, while feathered ornaments displayed colors that no European dye could reproduce. The emperor personally placed these offerings around Cortés's neck, each gesture imbued with religious significance that connected the mortal recipient to cosmic forces beyond human understanding. To Aztec observers, this ceremony confirmed Moctezuma's divine wisdom and cosmic authority. By honoring the strangers with precious gifts and personal attention, the emperor demonstrated his ability to incorporate even unprecedented events into the sacred order that governed all existence. The theological framework that interpreted these actions as expressions of imperial majesty would soon be revealed as fatally flawed, but in this moment of ceremonial exchange, it seemed to validate traditional assumptions about the emperor's supernatural insight. Cortés received these gifts with the calculating appreciation of a man who understood their material value while remaining completely oblivious to their spiritual significance. The gold that adorned his person represented potential financing for future campaigns, while the emperor's deference suggested psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited for strategic advantage. The conquistador's response, offering Moctezuma a necklace of Venetian glass beads, while attempting to embrace him as an equal, revealed the cultural chasm that separated European and Mesoamerican concepts of appropriate behavior. The attempted embrace created a crisis of protocol that sent shockwaves through the assembled Aztec nobility. For any mortal being to touch the emperor's sacred person without explicit permission constituted sacrilege that threatened cosmic order, while the casual familiarity implied by such a gesture violated fundamental assumptions about the hierarchical relationships that governed all social interaction. Only the quick intervention of Cuitlahua and other nobles prevented what might have become an immediate diplomatic catastrophe. The procession that subsequently carried both leaders into Tenochtitlan created a spectacle that amazed Spanish observers, while troubling Aztec priests, who struggled to interpret its theological implication. Cortés and his officers rode through streets paved with stones that had been fitted together with mathematical precision, past buildings that displayed architectural achievements that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. The city's population, estimated by Spanish sources at over 200,000 inhabitants, lined the causeways and rooftops to witness an encounter that their poets would struggle to describe, and their historians would debate for generations. The palace of Axayacatl, where Moctezuma housed his guests, represented both generous hospitality and strategic miscalculation. This sprawling complex, originally built for Moctezuma's father, contained hundreds of rooms decorated with murals that depicted the mythological and historical achievements of the Mexica people. Its courtyards could accommodate thousands of visitors, while its storage chambers held sufficient supplies to sustain an army for months. By placing the Spanish contingent in these luxurious quarters, the emperor demonstrated imperial magnificence, while inadvertently providing his enemies with a fortified position in the heart of his capital. The days that followed this initial meeting revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Aztec and Spanish objectives. Moctezuma sought to incorporate these powerful strangers into the existing cosmic order through a combination of religious ceremony and political negotiation, confident that proper ritual observance would eventually resolve any diplomatic complication. Cortés, conversely, used each ceremonial exchange to gather intelligence about Aztec military capabilities, economic resources, and political vulnerabilities, while planning the moves that would give him control over the empire. The cultural misunderstandings that complicated these interactions went far beyond simple translation problems. When Moctezuma spoke of the god's will and cosmic obligation, Cortés heard superstition that could be manipulated for practical advantage. When Spanish demands for gold were explained as royal tribute required by their distant sovereign, Aztec listeners interpreted these claims within frameworks of ritual reciprocity,
that bore no relationship to European concepts of territorial sovereignty. The theological discussions that occupied many hours of these early meetings revealed the depth of conceptual differences between Christian and Mesoamerican religious tradition. Spanish priests accompanying the expedition attempted to explain doctrines of salvation, redemption, and eternal judgment to Aztec listeners, whose cosmology emphasized cyclical time, cosmic balance, and humanity's obligation to nourish the gods who sustained the universe. Neither group possessed sufficient cultural knowledge to bridge these philosophical chasms. While political pressures made genuine understanding increasingly unlikely, the Web Titans, within days of his arrival in Tenochtitlan, Cortés had identified the strategic vulnerabilities that would allow him to destroy an empire with fewer soldiers than Moctezuma employed to clean his palace floors. The city's island location, which provided natural defense against conventional assault, also created dependence on supply lines that could be severed by enemies who controlled the causeway. The tribute system that generated Aztec wealth required continuous military pressure to prevent rebellion, while the religious calendar that governed imperial administration created predictable periods of distraction that foreign enemies could exploit. More importantly, Cortés recognized that Moctezuma's theological education had become a crippling disadvantage in dealing with opponents who operated according to entirely different principles. The emperor's every response to Spanish initiatives reflected religious assumptions that Cortés could manipulate while remaining immune to their psychological influence. Where Moctezuma saw cosmic tests and divine messages, the conquistador perceived tactical opportunities and strategic weaknesses. The crescendo of this deadly dance came on November 14th, 6 days after the initial meeting, when Cortés made the decision that would determine the fate of both leaders. Acting on intelligence that suggested growing Aztec resistance to Spanish presence, and recognizing that his position would become untenable if indigenous forces had time to organize effective opposition, the conquistador ordered the seizure of Moctezuma himself. The arrest of the Aztec emperor represented perhaps the most audacious gamble in the history of European expansion. Cortés entered the imperial palace with fewer than 30 soldiers, confronted a ruler whose word could summon millions of warriors, and demanded that this divine monarch accompany him as a prisoner to Spanish quarters. The psychological warfare that made this impossible situation successful reflected both Cortés's tactical brilliance and Moctezuma's fatal inability to conceive of behavior that violated every assumption about appropriate conduct between political authority. The emperor's initial response to Spanish demands revealed the theological paralysis that would characterize his final month. Rather than summoning guards who waited just outside the chamber, or raising the alarm that would have brought thousands of warriors to his defense, Moctezuma engaged in philosophical discussions about the nature of divine will and cosmic obligation. This reaction, which Spanish observers interpreted as cowardice or confusion, actually reflected sophisticated religious thinking that sought to understand Spanish actions within frameworks of prophecy and supernatural intervention. The captivity that followed this bizarre arrest created a constitutional crisis that exposed fundamental weaknesses in Aztec political organization. The empire's administrative system had evolved to channel all significant decisions through the person of the emperor, whose divine authority made his commands unquestionable and his wisdom absolute. With Moctezuma under Spanish control, this centralized structure became a weapon that Cortés could use against the very people it was designed to serve. The months of imprisonment that followed revealed the psychological complexity of both leaders, while demonstrating how personal relationships could intersect with historical forces to produce unintended consequences. Moctezuma, convinced that proper understanding would eventually resolve all conflicts, attempted to educate his captors about Aztec civilization, while seeking divine guidance for unprecedented circumstances. Cortés, recognizing the emperor's intelligence and political sophistication, developed what appeared to be genuine respect for his prisoner, while ruthlessly exploiting every advantage that their relationship provided. Yet beneath these surface courtesies, forces were gathering that would soon make diplomatic resolution impossible. The Spanish demand for gold had stripped temples and palaces of their sacred ornaments, outraging priests who viewed these acts as cosmic sacrilege. The prohibition of human sacrifice had disrupted religious ceremonies that Aztec theology deemed essential for maintaining universal order, while Spanish destruction of temple idols had violated sanctuaries that had been considered inviolate for generations. More fundamentally, the very presence of armed foreigners in Tenochtitlan's ceremonial center represented a pollution of sacred space that threatened the cosmic relationships upon which Aztec civilization was founded. The longer Spanish forces remained in the capital, the more obvious it became that their objectives were incompatible with the empire's continued existence. The breaking point, the explosion that shattered the uneasy coexistence between Spanish occupiers and Aztec subjects, came during the festival of Tenochtitlan in May 1520, when Pedro de Alvarado's massacre of unarmed nobles in the Templo Mayor transformed political crisis into racial war. The Spanish captain, left in command during Cortés's absence to confront Panfilo de Narvaez on the coast, had interpreted the elaborate preparations for this religious festival as evidence of planned rebellion, responding with preemptive violence that killed hundreds of Tenochtitlan's political and religious elite. The festival itself represented the most sacred ceremony in the Aztec religious calendar, a month-long celebration that reenacted the cosmic drama of divine sacrifice and renewal. Young men chosen for their physical perfection spent the year embodying the god Tezcatlipoca, learning songs and dances that connected human performance to celestial movements, while receiving honors that acknowledged their approaching transformation from mortality to divinity. The climactic sacrifice of these god impersonators was understood not as murder but as cosmic necessity, the voluntary offering of life that enabled the universe to continue its cycles of creation and destruction. Alvarado's troops, positioned around the temple courtyard to observe these proceedings, saw only what their cultural background allowed them to perceive: a gathering of armed men engaged in activities that European Christianity defined as demonic idolatry. The dancing nobles, painted with sacred designs and wearing costumes that incorporated precious feathers and metals, appeared to Spanish eyes as warriors preparing for battle rather than priests performing essential cosmic maintenance. The massacre that followed revealed both Spanish military efficiency and the cultural blindness that had characterized European interactions with indigenous peoples from the beginning of contact. Crossbow bolts and arquebus fire cut down dancers before they could comprehend what was happening, while steel swords carved through cotton armor as if it were paper. Within minutes, the courtyard that had echoed with sacred songs was filled with blood and screaming, the cosmic harmony that the ceremony was meant to ensure replaced by chaos and horror. The Aztec response to this atrocity transformed Moctezuma from prisoner to pariah overnight. The emperor's failure to prevent or punish Spanish sacrilege convinced his own people that he had either lost his divine protection or chosen to collaborate with cosmic enemy. The nobles who had previously obeyed his every command now questioned his fundamental legitimacy, while the priests who had validated his spiritual authority declared that the gods had withdrawn their favor from a ruler who allowed sacred spaces to be polluted by foreign violence. When Cortés returned to Tenochtitlan in late June, he found a city transformed from hospitable host to implacable enemy. The causeways that had welcomed Spanish processions now bristled with defensive barriers, while the markets that had supplied European needs stood empty of vendors and goods. Most ominously, the imperial palace that had housed Spanish forces in comfort now stood as an isolated fortress surrounded by populations that had discovered their capacity for resistance. The emperor's final public appearance came when Cortés forced him to address the crowds that surrounded the Spanish quarters, attempting to use Moctezuma's residual authority to restore order and Spanish freedom of movement. This pathetic scene, a divine ruler reduced to pleading with his own subjects on behalf of their enemies, represented the complete destruction of political relationships that had governed Mesoamerica for generations. The stones and arrows that greeted Moctezuma's speech carried messages more eloquent than words. His people, who had prostrated themselves before his divine presence for nearly 2 decades, now saw him as a collaborator whose continued existence threatened their cosmic and terrestrial survival. The missiles that struck the emperor's body, causing wounds that would prove fatal within days, symbolized the complete rejection of political authority that had lost its connection to divine will. Moctezuma's death on June 29, 1520, removed the last barrier to total warfare between Spanish forces and Aztec defenders. Whether he died from wounds received during the stoning, as Spanish sources claim, or from Spanish hands, as Aztec accounts suggest, his passing eliminated any possibility of negotiated resolution to the crisis that his initial hospitality had created. The Reckoning, the flight of Spanish forces from Tenochtitlan during La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows on June 30, 1520, marked the temporary triumph of indigenous resistance over European technology and indigenous collaboration. Weighted down by gold that had once seemed like the guarantee of wealth but now threatened to drag them to the bottom of Lake Tex, Cortés's soldiers fought their way across causeways turned into killing grounds while their Tlaxcalan allies paid in blood for their association with foreign enemies. Yet this Aztec victory contained the seeds of ultimate defeat. Moctezuma's death had created a succession crisis that weakened imperial administration precisely when effective leadership was most needed. His successor, Cuitlahuac, possessed the military skills and political determination to organize effective resistance, but died within months from smallpox that European contact had introduced to populations with no previous exposure to Old World disease. The biological warfare that devastated indigenous communities represented perhaps the most decisive factor in determining the conquest's ultimate outcome. Diseases that killed Europeans in manageable percentages proved catastrophic among populations that lacked genetic resistance developed through millennia of exposure. The epidemic that swept through Tenochtitlan during the winter of 1520-1521, rather than attempting to hold the capital through occupation of its ceremonial center, Spanish forces methodically destroyed the causeways and aqueducts that made urban life possible while preventing food supplies from reaching the island city. This strategy of strangulation proved more effective than direct assault, gradually reducing Tenochtitlan's defenders to conditions that made continued resistance impossible. The final assault that began in August 1521 pitted Spanish technology and indigenous allies against Aztec desperation and divine obligation. Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor, had organized his remaining forces around the understanding that defeat meant not merely political subordination but cosmic catastrophe, the end of the fifth sun and the beginning of universal darkness. The defenders who fought from rooftop to rooftop through the ruins of their capital were motivated by more than patriotism or personal survival. They fought to maintain the religious obligations that kept the universe functioning, to preserve the sacred calendar that organized time itself, and to protect the temples where gods received the nourishment that sustained all existence. Their resistance represented the last desperate attempt to prevent cosmic collapse through human will and divine favor. When Cuauhtémoc finally surrendered on August 13, 1521, the political structure that had governed Mesoamerica for nearly a century died with him. The Spanish victory was total. Not merely the conquest of territory but the destruction of worldview, the replacement of one understanding of reality with another that left no space for indigenous concepts of divinity, authority, or human obligation. The meeting between Moctezuma and Cortés that had begun with ceremonial exchange of gifts thus ended with the elimination of the civilization that had made such gifts possible. The theological confusion that had paralyzed the emperor when faced with unprecedented challenges gave way to colonial administrative systems that reduced divine rulers to tributary subjects and cosmic obligations to criminal superstition. Yet the encounter between these two extraordinary individuals reveals truths about power, culture, and historical change that transcend their specific circumstance. Moctezuma's tragedy lay not in weakness but in the strength of his convictions, his inability to imagine that cosmic order could be overthrown by mortal will. Cortés' triumph reflected not supernatural favor but practical intelligence, his capacity to exploit the religious assumptions that his enemies could not abandon. Their meeting reminds us that history's most decisive moments often occur when worldviews collide with sufficient force to shatter the assumptions that make normal life possible. The In such encounters, victory belongs not necessarily to the most virtuous or even the most powerful, but to those who can adapt most quickly to circumstances that no previous experience has prepared them to understand. The dust that settled over Tenochtitlan's ruins carried the dreams of two civilizations, one destroyed by its own certainties, the other triumphant through its willingness to abandon any principle for practical advantage. In that dust, empires fall and new worlds are born, teaching us that the meeting of gods and steel always ends with the transformation of both.